We had a very long discussion, a 3-hour meeting. It was a very interesting one. We had the briefings by the 3 police commissioners. Well, first of all, by Undersecretary Jean-Pierre Lacroix of the PKO, but also by the 3 police commissioners in Mali, Haiti, and Darfur. And it was really very interesting to hear their perspective, their insight on how, how central the police components of the peacekeeping operation are, and how to even ameliorate them, to make them even better. So would like to also to express satisfaction for the resolution approved. Italy was the proponent, the pen holder. We have worked a lot with DPKO and the police division for that result, and I think it's a good step forward. And the resolution actually had 3 objectives. The first, the contribution, to recognize the contribution of police, United Nations police, in preventing conflicts and sustaining peace. And the fact that they are and they must be an integral part of the mandates of peace operations. Strengthen the United Nations police role in protecting civilians, also preventing, sexual and gender conflict-related violence, and provide guidance. The third issue on what is required to improve accountability, transparency, efficiency, and effectiveness in the performance of the police contingents, also through possibly an increased number of police of women.
"250 Canadians just landed on the edge of the Sahara Desert, joining the United Nations mission to Mali in West Africa, the UN's deadliest operation. Since it began 5 years ago, at least 170 peacekeepers have been killed here. And Mali follows what's become a familiar pattern of peacekeeping. It's the world's poorest countries that are doing most of the work and paying the heaviest price.
If you look at the missions over the last few years, it has been, as you would expect, it's been the developing countries who have their troops on the front line, who take the lion's share of the casualties.
Canada proposed the first major UN peacekeeping mission during the Suez Crisis in 1956. That earned Canadian Foreign Minister Lester B. Pearson the Nobel Peace Prize. And Canada remained a top peacekeeping country through the Cold War and into the 90s. In '94, on the heels of the Rwandan genocide, the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, the US, UK, France, Russia, and China, provided 20% of the total peacekeeping personnel. But fast forward a decade, and that contribution plummeted to 5%.
The West remains, frankly, very reluctant to engage in any of these large UN missions.
At its peacekeeping peak in the early 90s, Canada provided more than 3,000 troops.
As wealthy Western countries step back from peacekeeping, poorer countries are picking up the slack. In fact, some of the world's top peacekeeping countries are also among the poorest on Earth.
Ethiopia, Rwanda, and Nepal top the UN's list, but rank near the bottom when it comes to GDP per capita. And their reasons for sending large numbers of UN troops aren't always altruistic.
Well, at the risk of sounding rather cynical, a lot of the poor countries do make quite a lot of money from participating in UN missions.
Each month, the UN pays the equivalent of about 1,800 Canadian dollars per peacekeeper. That money goes not to the troops directly, but to their country's government.
It's tragic that something like peace should become monetarized, but it has been. Many of the troop contributing countries are not dependent, but a lot of their GDP comes from the money they get from peacekeeping. Which is why they're so keen to do it.
The result is often UN peacekeepers who are poorly trained and equipped, facing increasingly complicated conflicts such as Mali, where up to 20 different rebel groups are battling for control.
And so basically what you're doing is you're putting peacekeepers into situations where often there isn't really a peace to keep.
Canada's UN mission to Mali will end after 1 year, but most expect the conflict here to drag on for many years to come, and peacekeepers from mostly poor countries to continue to pay with their lives.
They play a vital role. I would like to pay tribute to each and every one of them. Their contribution is crucial both in bringing security, in protection of civilians, and they also play a vital role in strengthening local capacities in the area of rule of law institution, particularly police. And you will have in mind that one operation, the one in Haiti, has been now transformed from MINUSTA to MINUJUST, and it's an operation that is clearly focused on this role of strengthening rule of law capacity. We still have challenges in terms of performance, in terms of equipment, in terms of training, in terms of better integration of the work of the police component with the other component of peacekeeping. Of course, we have to strictly implement the UN policy on conduct and discipline, particularly in sexual exploitation and abuse, as far as police components are concerned, as well as other components are concerned.
Including training, it will make sure that, of course, United Nations police will continue to do a good work in terms of protection of civilians. Of course, it wouldn't be also done without the senior leadership of the Department of Peacekeeping Operations.
I have addressed this Council several times over the past year on peacekeeping reform. It is now time to take action together. At its best, UN peacekeeping is a remarkable enterprise of multilateralism and international solidarity. And UN peacekeeping missions now operate in far more dangerous, complex and high-risk environments. They are under threat from armed groups, criminals and terrorists who have access to powerful modern weapons. UN peacekeepers are often under-equipped, under-prepared and unready for the dangerous environments in which they now operate. There are gaps in command and control, in culture, in equipment and in training. Our peacekeepers are vulnerable and they are targeted for attack.
The word peacekeeping does not appear in the Charter of the United Nations. But for the past 7 decades, our collective ability to maintain international peace and security has often depended on the willingness of courageous UN peacekeepers to put their lives on the line in war-torn countries of the world. more than 1 million men and women in blue helmets have prevented violence and preserved peace. They have saved lives. They've given societies a chance to rebuild. Through bitter experience in places like Bosnia and Rwanda, we've learned painful lessons, and we've worked to do better. Right now, as we speak, more than 100,000 troops and police are deployed around the world, training police in Haiti, promoting stability in Lebanon, protecting civilians in South Sudan. We know that peace operations are not the solution to every problem, but they do remain one of the world's most important tools to address armed conflict. And I called for this summit because UN peacekeeping operations are experiencing unprecedented strains. Old challenges persist. Too few nations bear a disproportionate burden of providing troops, which is unsustainable. Atop this, we've seen new challenges. More armed conflicts, more instability driven by terrorism and violent extremism, and more refugees. As a consequence, peacekeepers head into more difficult and deadlier conflicts. They're given ambitious mandates and charged with increasingly dangerous and complex missions. Just yesterday, a UN peacekeeper was killed in Darfur, and we've seen reports today of a tragic incident in the Central African Republic. Put simply, the supply of well-trained, well-equipped peacekeepers can't keep up with the growing demand. So we are here today, together, to strengthen and reform UN peacekeeping because our common security demands it. As the largest financial contributor to the UN peacekeeping operations, the United States intends to continue to do its part. And today I'm issuing new presidential guidance, the first in more than 20 years, to expand our support for UN peace operations. Like the nations participating today, we'll pledge additional resources. We'll work to double the number of U.S. military officers serving in peacekeeping operations. We will offer logistical support, including our unrivaled network of air and sea lift. When there is an urgent need and we're uniquely positioned to help, we'll undertake engineering projects like building airfields and base camps for new missions. And we'll step up our efforts to help build the UN's capacity, from identifying state-of-the-art technology to offering training to protection against IEDs. First, more nations need to contribute more forces. We are joined today by countries from every region of the world, and I want to thank those who already do so much and commend those who have come here prepared to do more. At this summit, more than 50 countries, from Bangladesh to Colombia, from Finland to China, are making commitments totaling more than 30,000 new troops and police. And they're stepping up with critical contributions like medical units, helicopters, and capabilities to counter IEDs, which will help peacekeepers be able to stay safe and succeed in their missions. This all represents significant progress, and over the coming years, I believe more nations can make even more contributions. Second, we need to improve the protection of civilians. Unlike 20 years ago, today's UN peacekeepers have the clear authority to safeguard the innocent, but it is still applied unevenly. That's why the principles and best practices for civilian protection laid out in Kigali are so important. The overwhelming number of peacekeepers serve with honor and decency in extraordinarily difficult situations. But we have seen some appalling cases of peacekeepers abusing civilians, including rape and sexual assault, and that is totally unacceptable. It's an affront to human decency. It undermines the core mission because it erodes trust with communities. It has a corrosive effect on global confidence in peacekeeping itself. Mr. Secretary General, we commend you for leading on this issue and insisting on accountability. And we know you cannot solve this problem alone. As leaders and as an international community, we have to insist on zero tolerance for abuse. Zero. If we provide the support and embrace the reforms that I've described today, I believe we can strengthen peace operations for decades to come.
The United States of America is the greatest force for freedom and security that the world has ever known. And in no small measure, that's because we built the best trained, best led, best equipped military in history. And as Commander-in-Chief, I'm going to keep it that way. The Budget Control Act passed by Congress last year, with the support of Republicans and Democrats alike, mandates reductions in federal spending, including defense spending. I've insisted that we do that responsibly. The security of our nation and the lives of our men and women in uniform depend on it. We can't afford to repeat the mistakes that have been made in the past. After World War II, after Vietnam, when our military was left ill-prepared for the future. As Commander-in-Chief, I will not let that happen again. Not on my watch. Yes, the tide of war is receding, but the question that this strategy answers is what kind of military will we need long after the wars of the last decade are over. And today, we're fortunate to be moving forward from a position of strength. So yes, our military will be leaner, but the world must know the United States is going to maintain our military superiority with armed forces that are agile, flexible, and ready for the full range of contingencies and threats. Some will no doubt say that the spending reductions are too big. Others will say that they're too small. It will be easy to take issue with a particular change in a particular program, but I'd encourage all of us to remember what President Eisenhower once said, that each proposal must be weighed in the light of a broader consideration. The need to maintain balance in and among national programs. After a decade of war, and as we rebuild the source of our strength at home and abroad, it's time to restore that balance.
We also express our gratitude to the 95,000 civilian, police and military personnel currently deployed around the world. They are facing one of the greatest challenges ever, delivering on their peace and security mandates while helping countries to address the COVID-19 pandemic. The theme of this year's observance, Women in Peacekeeping, highlights their central role in our operations. Women often have greater access in the communities we serve, enabling us to improve the protection of civilians, promote human rights, and enhance overall performance. This is especially important today, as female peacekeepers are on the front lines in supporting the response to COVID-19 in already fragile contexts, using local radio to spread public health messaging, delivering necessary supplies to communities for prevention, and supporting efforts of local peace builders. Yet, women continue to represent only 6% of uniformed military, police, justice and corrections personnel in field missions. As we commemorate the 20th anniversary of Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security, we must do more to achieve women's equal representation in all areas of peace and security. Together, let us continue to wage peace, defeat the pandemic, and build a better future.
China contributes the most troops among the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. There are over 2,500 Chinese serving in 7 mission fields, with 8,000 on reserve duty.
We seldom, if ever, see the PLA or its generals at United Nations headquarters, but we do see Ambassador Liu Jie and Beijing's team of diplomats every day in the Security Council dealing with the most serious of world issues. China's been the president of the Council for the month of July, a job that comes round every 15 months, but one that puts it in the driving seat of world affairs. Matthew Lee, an independent journalist who reports on the Security Council for his website Inner City Press.
Like every day, there's somebody in the world that should get an answer from the UN. And
he says China has learned to walk its own path within the UN walls.
They've made themselves kind of bulletproof. When the Russian ambassador goes through, people will. There have been times in the Syria conflict where people will say, "Come on, you're killing people. What about and it's like that. You don't really hear that, even on North Korea anymore. It's not just a rising power, it's a risen power. And the UN loves nothing more than to bow down to power.
But China's role at the UN is not limited to the so-called Permanent Five at headquarters here in Manhattan. Its influence stretches way beyond this complex on the east side of the city to where real people on the ground are caught up in conflict. Among the Permanent Five of the Security Council, China's the second biggest funder of Blue Helmet peacekeepers, and the People's Liberation Army is the biggest supplier of personnel. Chinese peacekeepers serve in South Sudan, Mali, Liberia, the DRC and Lebanon. According to the UN, the total number of Chinese peacekeepers is 2,515 as of June this year. Some are policemen and other staff, but the number of actual PLA troops is 2,200 plus. Compare that to 804 French peacekeepers, 700 from the UK, and fewer than 100 each from the US and Russia.
We've been trying for many years to get the 5 permanent members not simply to be the ones who decide the missions, but who also contribute to the peacekeeping missions that are approved by the Security Council. And China has played a very important role in that.
But the role of the Blue Helmets has changed over the years. Once it was separating 2 warring sides. Now it's far more complex. Keeping the peace, yes, but often in the face of immense suffering from displaced people with healthcare and nutrition issues, trying to lay the ground for a return to civil society. Sarah Cliff from New York University's Center on International Cooperation says China's willingness to take a direct role in UN affairs is giving it an edge on the world stage.
I believe that gives China a unique understanding of what the conditions on the ground actually are and an ability to influence discussions in Council based on that understanding. It really gives China the ability to push to make sure that there is a strong long-term strategy, make sure that societies come out of the problems that they've seen and can do without the sort of assistance that UN peacekeeping provides.
And as they celebrate the 90th anniversary of their founding, the People's Liberation Army can take some pride in knowing much of that is down to them.
Minnesota Governor Mark Dayton called for a review of the state's police body camera policies, following the fatal shooting of Justine Demond. Police officer Mohammed Noor shot and killed Demond on Saturday night, and both his camera and his partner Matthew Harrity's camera were turned off during the shooting. As with other police shootings around the country, it will be the local prosecutor who chooses whether to bring charges against Officer Noor. That power, or discretion, makes the elections to fill those prosecutor positions extremely important. And that's why one billionaire international donor is putting big money into local races all around the country.
In March, Aramis Ayala, the first black state attorney elected in Florida, said her office would no longer seek the death penalty. 3 months later, Kim Foxx, the state attorney for Cook County, Illinois, announced her support for releasing nonviolent defendants without cash bail. Foxx and Ayala are the latest in a string of progressive prosecutors who all have one thing in common. Backing from the liberal billionaire George Soros. Since 2015, Soros has funded 14 reform-focused candidates in local district attorney races, including primaries, across the country. 10 of them are now in office, and one, Larry Krasner, is standing for general election in the fall in Philadelphia after winning the Democratic primary in May. Soros' contributions flow through state-level PACs that all share the Safety and Justice moniker. They've ranged from $21,000 in Milwaukee to $1.9 million in Arizona's Maricopa County, which Soros spent in a failed effort to defeat the Republican district attorney. All in all, Soros has spent $11.2 million on DA races. So why spend so much money to elect local prosecutors?
There's almost no reform you want that prosecutors couldn't implement today using their own discretion. If you want bail reform, then prosecutors can simply stop asking for bail. If you want to see shorter sentences, then during plea bargaining, prosecutors just offer lesser sentences. They have so much discretion. There's nothing they couldn't really accomplish if they didn't want to.
Prosecutors run for office in 46 states. And historically, the easiest way to win election has been to be tough on crime.
The politics of punishment are incredibly strongly stacked in favor of being punitive.
This is precisely what Soros wants to change. And by targeting relatively low-profile races, in which he's typically the largest donor, he's making sure he gets the most bang for the buck. Pfaff says that if Soros wants to make the most impact, he should focus on prosecutors in rural areas, like Mississippi's Scott Colum, to whom Soros gave almost $1 million.
The high population counties have been decarcerating and becoming more progressive in criminal justice matters for years. Less urban and more rural counties have been becoming actually tougher.
He's one of the richest men in the world. He's given away a staggering $32 billion. But is the billionaire philanthropist George Soros at the heart of a global conspiracy?
I fear we could be looking at the biggest level of international political collusion in history.
They're called globalists. Oh, come on.
Allegations are multiplying of secret Soros plots. orchestrating violence on the streets of America, and masterminding a hoax bomb plot to bring down the president.
The whole thing is a complete fantasy.
So how did George Soros become the arch-villain? Born in 1930 to Jewish parents in Hungary, he survived the Holocaust to become one of the richest men and one of the biggest philanthropists in the world.
George Soros, as a person who studied philosophy, he always had a hankering to do more than simply make money.
Soros's fortune has given his Open Society foundations $1 billion a year to fund thousands of education, health, human rights, and democracy projects. Soros has pioneered a bold political approach to philanthropy, championing the rights of dissidents, migrants, and the oppressed. Starting in 1979, he focused on the former communist states. His foundations now operate in more than 120 countries around the world.
A democracy or open society only survives if it's tested. It's constantly in danger. It's constantly in danger of falling apart, and there must be some people who'll fight to preserve it.
From his New York base, he's made an incredible $44 billion through financial speculation. But he's accused of channeling his vast wealth in pursuit of a secret plan to overthrow governments, to control European politics.
Please join me in welcoming George Soros.
And to buy up the US Democratic Party, all to impose his own global vision.
People are so aware of his name now on the right that if you say it's Soros funded or that it's linked to George Soros, it immediately puts up a red flag. People in middle America, sure, see him as a globalist, see him as an elitist.
We don't want people pouring into our country. We have no idea who they are, where they come from.
We will build a great wall along the southern border.
There's one issue above all that's enraged the right. They claim George Soros wants open borders and has a secret plan to flood the country with migrants. In autumn 2018, thousands of migrants left Honduras bound for the USA. It was just a month before the crucial midterm elections that threatened to derail Trump's presidency. Immediately, the so-called migrant caravan was blamed on George Soros.
Do you think somebody's funding a caravan? Do you think everybody's paying for a caravan?
I wouldn't be surprised. Yeah, I wouldn't be
George
surprised.
Soros?
I wouldn't. I don't know who, but I wouldn't be surprised. A lot of people say yes.
We don't fund caravans. We do fund policy change. We do look for ways to solve the crisis over migration, but that does not include the funding of caravans. Those are preposterous allegations made up by politicians and others who want to fuel hatred and fear.
Across Europe, the Soros conspiracy theories are spreading. In Italy, he's now accused of funding rescue ships in the Mediterranean, whose real purpose is to smuggle migrants to Europe. Italy's former Deputy Prime Minister, Matteo Salvini, is a fierce critic.
I'm shocked that a country like Italy will have a deputy prime minister eliciting such vile and base rhetoric. It's tragic, but it's not only Salvini.
George Soros has made no secret of his views on Brexit, publicly contributing more than $2 million to the Remain campaign. Now talk of a secret Soros plot is spreading to the UK.
George Soros recently gave Open Society $18 billion. And his influence here and in Brussels is truly extraordinary. I fear we could be looking at the biggest level of international political collusion in history.
The George Soros conspiracy, this is like probably the most successful political product of our time. You know, it helped President Trump, it helped Brexit, it's being used all over Europe, it's being used from Kenya to Colombia. George Soros everywhere. It's like a globalized, perfect enemy for the new right movement.
Terrifies me that this kind of rhetoric, which used to be heard in beer halls and dark corners, is being spoken by politicians, by leaders of country, the deputy prime minister of Italy, the prime minister of Hungary. That this kind of language is being used is shocking.
All under the seal, funding and direction of Mr. George Soros and his foundation, the Open Society Institute. We call him a criminal. It is known that George Soros is a billionaire, a financial speculator and a criminal with obvious geostrategic and imperialistic interests, who has been dedicating his life to supporting imperialist movements and to expand capitalism by shedding blood in countless countries over very many decades. We would like to inform national and international public opinion that they should not be fooled or confused if philanthropic actions appear to be funded by this man and his foundation. We must be clear that to Soros, it's all the same to him whether he is financing civil rights movements or criminal movements, either through peaceful or through violent means, in order to destroy entire societies and nations. There are no shortage of examples. We cannot forget and should not forget that George Soros played a key role in the counter-revolutionary and anti-communist processes in Eastern Europe, especially between 1984 and 1989, supporting, for example, the anti-communist trade union movement, Solidarity in Poland, or supporting the Charter 77 in Czechoslovakia. Today, the world is witnessing the situation of countries like Libya and others. We know that Soros gave instructions on how to undermine the protests in Albania in 2011. Recently, Soros has acknowledged having funded the coup leaders in Ukraine in 2014, with all the atrocities that that supposed. Soros has intervened in the overthrow of former Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff, and he's no stranger to the war in Syria. The list of Soros's destructive interventions in different countries is endless. All this so that it be known who George Soros is, how he works, and what he works for. Always with the aim of expanding his negative influence at the cost of financing destabilization movements in different countries of the world. If in doing this terrorism and jihadism have to be financed, he finances it. For him, the attacks promoted by terrorists and jihadists, no matter how heinous they may be, do not matter. The important thing is that he destroys his targets and accumulates more wealth. Equatorial Guinea is united as a single man supporting our head of state, His Excellency Obiang Nguema Mbasogo. We will continue fighting to maintain peace, social balance, national cohesion, and a social order, a healthy social order. And be a guardian of law and equity, proving that the children of this nation cannot be moved around like pieces on a global chessboard where the criminal George Soros is playing the game.
George Soros is a billionaire, but somehow his own money isn't enough to fund the totality of his anti-American agenda. So, U.S. taxpayers had to step into the breach and help as well, and they did. Department of Justice documents newly obtained by Judicial Watch, thank heaven, show that in 2016, the Obama administration whose misdeeds are now just coming to light, gave almost $9 million to support something called the East-West Management Institute. That's a Soros-funded venture. According to Judicial Watch, the money did little other than empower the socialist government of Albania, which spends a lot of time making its people more miserable. Tom Fitton is the president of Judicial Watch, and he joins us tonight. One of the reasons I'm so glad that you're here, Tom, is because you kind of tie a bow on stories. The Obama administration's over, but there's a lot that they did that we don't know anything about because the press refused to cover those stories. Tell us this small piece of it. What did they do in Albania and why?
Well, they're supporting the socialist communist government there, the Soros operations, and they're doing it with taxpayer dollars. They were doing it in 2016, and they were even doing it in the first part of the Trump administration in 2017, co-sponsoring surveys of the population that generated 91% of the support in favor of the pro-government, pro-Soros operation that would have restricted the independence of the judiciary. You know, like all strongman governments, they don't like independent judiciaries. Right. So they were trying to reform the judiciary in a way that would have brought it under control of the socialist government there. And what's troubling is that obviously Soros needs no taxpayer money to do any of this advocacy work. But the State Department and USAID is partnering with Soros and basically allowing Soros to set our foreign policy agenda. And then secondly, Soros's operations, according to these documents, were allowed to come into the State Department and provide technical reviews of other applications for other government money in Albania.
But, I mean, George Soros hates the United States, and I'm judging that by the projects that he funds, all of which are designed to change the country as it is now or to thwart U.S. interests. So why in the world would any State Department give money to a Soros-funded operation?
Well, it's not only in Albania. We have had four lawsuits at one point. Albania, Romania, he's active in Hungary, Guatemala, Colombia. They're very, very active, and it doesn't take a lot of money to have a big impact in these countries. And the governments are under assault from the Soros State Department unity effort to bring socialism and stop anything in the area of reform, constitutionalism, the sort of things that Americans would be comfortable with. The Soros groups aren't. And, you know, look, he's a billionaire. He doesn't need the money. And when you fund him in one place, it means he has more money to spend elsewhere. So if you don't like what Soros is doing here at home, you should know it's being indirectly subsidized thanks to the State Department and USAID, at least as long ago as 2016.
So Soros is getting State Department money. Planned Parenthood, which is an arm of the Democratic Party, gets $500 million a year in taxpayer funds. Is there any right of center or pro-America group that gets any taxpayer funding of any kind?
Well, I think most of them don't think to ask for it. But certainly the State Department is not terribly interested in funding groups that are antagonistic to their agenda abroad. And this is kind of another way for the State Department to stick it to the Trump administration. Yeah. Because some of this activity was taking place in early 2017. again, attacking the idea of an independent judiciary in Albania. This is your tax dollars at work, and we had to sue to get the records.
The more you know, the more appalling it is. And thank you for bringing this to light. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Tom Fitton.